In 1969, after successfully dodging the Vietnam draft 5 times, Cheney landed an internship at the White House during the Nixon administration. A low-level position, sure, but it gave him a front-row seat to watch how the real players in Washington operated. And there was one man in particular who caught his eye: Donald Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld was the definition of ruthless. He wasn't concerned with ideology, with principles, or with doing what was right. He was concerned with winning. And to win, you needed power. The problem was he had a big mouth. And because of this big mouth, everybody in the Nixon administration hated him. This became apparent when he was appointed United States ambassador to NATO. And Cheney? Cheney was watching. When Nixon resigned in the aftermath of Watergate, many in Washington saw it as the collapse of a corrupt system. But for Rumsfeld and Cheney, it was an opening. At that time, any Republican who wasn't touched by Watergate was as good as gold. Rummy went to become the White House Chief of Staff under President Ford. And when he was appointed Secretary of Defense, guess who got his job? None other than Dick Cheney. At just 34 years old, he became one of the youngest ever to hold the position. For now, it seemed like Cheney's rise was unstoppable. Until it wasn't.
With 272 electoral votes.
In 1976, Jimmy Carter won the presidency. And just like that, Cheney was out of a job. For most people, this would be a devastating blow. But for Cheney, it was just a setback. He turned his attention to Wyoming, running for Congress, where he won easily. And this was where his political persona really began to take shape. Cheney was no moderate. He wasn't interested in compromise. He opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. He voted against sanctions on South Africa during apartheid. To Cheney, politics wasn't about doing what was right. It was about doing what was necessary to maintain control. But Congress wasn't enough for Cheney. He needed more. Dick Cheney's ascent into the inner sanctum of the Bush Sr. administration was no accident. It was a calculated rise of a man who understood power, and more importantly, how to wield it. By 1989, Cheney had already proven himself in Washington with his no-nonsense approach to governance. He entered Bush Sr.'s administration as the Secretary of Defense, stepping into a pivotal role at a time when the Cold War's end signaled seismic shifts in global politics. As Secretary of Defense, Cheney quickly became the architect of America's post-Cold War military strategy. He took control of the Pentagon during the final months of the Soviet Union's collapse, guiding the U.S. military through an uncertain time when the very definition of America's enemies was changing. His focus was clear: maintaining American military dominance, even as the landscape of warfare began to shift from massive nuclear arsenals to regional conflicts and unconventional threats. The Gulf War in 1991 became Cheney's defining moment. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait was a test, not only of American resolve, but also of Cheney's strategic mind. In the shadow of Operation Desert Storm, Cheney stood as a calculating figure, advising Bush Sr. on the necessity of military action. His focus was on precision, overwhelming force, and minimizing U.S. casualties, principles that would come to define the war. Cheney worked closely with General Colin Powell, crafting a strategy that swiftly pushed Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait. It was a decisive victory, but one fraught with consequences. After noticing that his polling to run for president was the lowest in the Republican Party, in 1995, Cheney made a move that would surprise everyone. He left politics altogether. He became the CEO of Halliburton, one of the largest oil and gas companies in the world. CEO Cheney wasn't just amassing wealth. He was amassing influence. The connections he made in the corporate world, especially in oil and defense, would prove invaluable later on. By the turn of the millennium, Bush Jr. was running for office, and he needed a vice presidential candidate. Someone with experience, someone with connections, someone who could help him navigate Washington's inner circles. He began placing loyalists in key positions throughout the government, people who would do his bidding without question. He pushed for policies that expanded executive power, notably the unitary executive theory, which argued that the president, and by extension Cheney, had almost unlimited authority in certain areas. And then, 9/11 happened. While Bush was paralyzed by indecision, Cheney acted decisively. He bypassed the normal chain of command, giving orders directly to the military. He pushed for an aggressive response to the attacks, and behind the scenes, he began building the case for the invasion of Iraq. Now this is where Cheney's true genius, and perhaps his greatest crime, comes into play. The Bush administration, led by Cheney, began cherry-picking intelligence that suggested Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. They used this as the justification to invade Iraq, even though the evidence was flimsy at best and completely fabricated at worst. Senior Iraqi leaders' denials of weapons of mass destruction programs were met with skepticism, while reports like those from Curveball, an unreliable defector, were given undue weight despite red flags. The use of Curveball's false testimony about movable biological labs significantly shaped the narrative presented to the public. As hope for a diplomatic resolution diminished, President Bush prepared to deliver the case for war. The most trusted figure in his administration, Colin Powell, was chosen to make the presentation to the United Nations. On February 5, 2003, Powell delivered a dramatic, though ultimately misleading, 66-minute speech, citing intercepted communications, satellite imagery, and Curveball's testimony. The speech, meant to galvanize support, included claims about Iraq's connections to militant groups and biological weapons, many of which were based on shaky intelligence or later disproven. Legally, the justification for war was ambiguous. UN Security Council Resolution 1441 was cited as the basis for military action, but its vague phrasing of serious consequences led to intense debate. The British government sought additional legal clarity, and Attorney General Lord Goldsmith argued that Iraq's non-compliance revived older resolutions from the Gulf War era. This thin legal rationale was enough for British and U.S. leaders to proceed, but many international legal experts, and even UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, later condemned the war as illegal. By March 17, 2003, Bush issued his final ultimatum to Saddam Hussein, and 3 days later, Operation Iraqi Freedom began, marking the start of a war that would reshape the Middle East.
It's one of the most transparent scams that's legal in the history of the world. Imagine a guy who's the vice president of the United States who is also a guy who used to be the CEO of Halliburton. Then this guy decides to go to war under false pretenses. They make up some shit about weapons of mass destruction. They blow this fucking place to smithereens, and then Halliburton gets no bid contracts. I mean, this wasn't someone saying, I can do it for $3 billion, I can do it for 2.7. There wasn't any of that. There was a no bid contract for billions of dollars to repair the places they blow up. And he was making money off of it. It's crazy. It was one of those things where you're like, wait. You just left. You just left, and then the company you just left is now getting no bid contracts in the billions. Am I stupid?
Right.
How are you allowed to do this on television in front of everybody?